make America more competitive in industries such as the semiconductor industry. And that's how we're going to maintain and grow our lead over China in the technology space.
At the semiconductor companies, executives say they'll be able to ramp up production to end the shortfall, but that likely won't happen until later in 2021. After the immediate shortages get resolved, the demand for semiconductors is only supposed to increase. New 5G telecom networks need smartphones with 5G-enabled chips. The so-called Internet of Things will put chips into more and more everyday devices, and the remote world brought on by COVID-19 appears here to stay. China is attempting to become self-sufficient when it comes to semiconductor chips. Right now, it imports most of its semiconductors.
Beijing has always had big ambitions to have its own homegrown industry, but the U.S. restrictions not only on sales to China for chips, but also especially on telecom giant Huawei. That has really acted as a stimulus for the industry. So Beijing has made chips a top priority for its next 5-year plan, which is going to be unveiled in March. Independence is one of 5 fundamentals of China's economic development, and $1.4 trillion has been earmarked to develop the semiconductor industry by 2025, with a goal to have 70% of chips used in China, made in China.
I think COVID-19, a lot of people in the business world start to really look at our supply chain because of COVID-19. And, it's no secret that the electronics manufacturing is kind of based in China, right? What people kind of don't know is that the number one pure chip factory in the world is in Taiwan. That's TSMC. Now, Taiwan's an ally. Taiwan has not had the trade issues that China has, but it's still an island off the coast of China. So there was a lot of discussion early in the pandemic last year that we have to look at this stuff from a geopolitical standpoint, because, if the military can't make a jet because they don't have chips, and then Taiwan is caught in a geopolitical dispute, a lot of people just said, we need the ability to make leading node chips here in the United States.
This video was sponsored by Audible. In 1965, a young engineer working at Fairchild Semiconductor, then one of the world's premier chip companies, looked at the processors his small team was churning out over the last couple of years and noticed something exciting. The company brought its first silicon transistor to market in 1958, a single component that would put the silicon into Silicon Valley decades later down the line. Just 2 years later, Fairchild managed to integrate 4 transistors into a single chip, and by 1965, that number had climbed up to 60. When asked by Electronics magazine where he thought the industry was headed, that engineer, called Gordon Moore, did some quick math extrapolating their existing pace of improvement and found that they'd go from 60 to 60,000 transistors per processor in the next 10 years. Initially just an observation that Moore himself wasn't sure would last very long, his colleagues over the years turned to calling it Moore's Law because of how accurately it ended up capturing the exponential growth trajectory the industry was on. While it was revised and adjusted multiple times later down the line, Moore's Law not only predicted the incredible increase in computing power, it sort of acted as a self-fulfilling prophecy. If it was true that semiconductors would get almost exponentially better with time, then investing almost exponentially higher amounts of money and human capital to fuel that growth would be worth it too. And that belief created arguably one of, if not the most complex industries in the world, with thousands of ultra-specialized companies that regularly make science fiction look mundane in comparison. Today, 100-ton machines are shooting lasers into tiny drops of liquid tin mid-air to turn it into plasma just to make your phone run a little faster. And a few chip companies have become so large that losing access to them can bring entire economies on their knees. The semiconductor industry is absolutely fascinating, and in the 74th episode of my Story Behind series, let's explore both the technologies and economics that drive it, and talk about how they impact everything from your frame rates to geopolitics. When Fairchild made its first silicon transistor, it had about a dozen employees who oversaw much of the process from the beginning to the end. A few years later, they had about 12,000 employees and made $130 million in revenue. The industry has professionalized at an incredible pace, and today, companies in the field typically specialize in 5 distinct domains. The first step in making a logic chip, which is the type that I'll be focusing primarily in this video, is creating its instruction set architecture, or ISA, which defines how the processor will perform its most basic instructions, like accessing memory, performing basic calculations, and so on. Anybody can theoretically make one, but ISAs become really powerful when they turn into industry standards. When that happens, processors and operating systems from multiple companies that follow that standard basically become interoperable. You can see this where Windows, Linux, and macOS are able to run on a huge variety of Intel and AMD chips through the power of x86, or say with Android phone makers through the power of ARM having the freedom to use any Qualcomm or MediaTek chip that they want, or even designing their own like Huawei and Samsung have. The aforementioned ISAs, so ARM and x86, are by the way by far the most popular ones in the industry, and while they've worked incredibly well as standards so far, there's a little bit of a problem with them. Specifically, they are one of 3 bottlenecks that the chip industry is experiencing. Intel and AMD, who own most of the x86 related IP, are only licensing their ISA to a single active competitor, and only because Intel was literally sued by the US government to stop being a competitive monopolist. That competitor, by the way, called VIA Technologies, is years behind the other 2 in tech and has quietly used their license to set up a joint venture with the Chinese local government to create homegrown x86 chips in China for government use called Chaoxin, so I don't think they'll be holding on to their license for very long. And ARM too is a private company, and while they have historically been pretty liberal with their licenses, their ongoing acquisition by Nvidia has created a lot of worries about their new American overlords potentially limiting licenses either for anti-competitive reasons or due to political pressure as well. Other ISAs exist, for example MIPS, which is used among other things in embedded devices like routers for example, or RISC-V, which is sort of the exciting open source alternative the industry is buzzing about these days, with the first development boards just having launched, but these are still pretty far from taking on the big 2, and as the Windows on ARM saga painfully demonstrates, moving something like a complex operating system to a new ISA can take decades. Step 2 in this process is chip design, and in comparison to ISAs, this is a much more diverse field, where most chip companies the average person is familiar with are actually active. At this stage, companies create the actual circuit diagrams, decide on how many cores a chip should have, how those and other components such as memory are arranged on the silicon, etc. They essentially create the blueprint. And while some chip designers like Intel and Samsung then also go ahead and manufacture what they have designed, the revolution of the last decade or 2 is that the vast majority of players are fabless, as they outsource the manufacturing to contract manufacturers called fabs. The ability to outsource manufacturing on the one hand and rely on ISAs for compatibility on the other hand has created an incredibly diverse field, as the companies in the middle can pretty much just focus on design and have everything else taken care of externally. And because of that, unsurprisingly, over the last decade or so, almost every company that uses lots of specialized chips has started designing their own lately, including Apple, Samsung, and Huawei for their phones, Microsoft and Amazon for their data centers, Google for its AI cloud service called TensorFlow, but also the so-called Pixel Visual Core for improving photography on Pixel phones. And as these primarily internet and software companies have increasingly specialized workloads from self-driving cars to AI in the cloud or whatever, I expect more and more of them to design their own chips rather than just rely on whatever Intel or Qualcomm is giving them. Stage 3 in chipmaking is getting those designs onto actual silicon wafers. This process is called fabrication. It is extremely complex and capital intensive, and as I mentioned before, it is most commonly done by specialized contract manufacturers called fabs these days, like Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company for example. This outsourced approach pioneered by TSMC TSMC in the late 80s has taken over most of the industry because it lets fabs pull together orders from many chip companies and share bleeding-edge machines and expertise between all of them, all while achieving huge economies of scale. For example, they can develop bleeding-edge processes and buy bleeding-edge machines for flagship smartphone chips, and then have those trickle down over the years for cheaper goods like processors found in less cutting-edge smartphone devices. And over the years, most chip companies have adopted this model, with Taiwanese UMC first spinning off its design arm, MediaTek, as a separate company, Samsung opening up its foundry to contract manufacturing, AMD spinning off its fab as global foundry so they could focus exclusively on design, and even Intel lately admitting that they might start outsourcing some of their manufacturing to external foundries too. Fabricating a chip consists of thousands of highly specialized processes, and it is one of the most expensive things in the world, with TSMC planning to spend over half of its revenues, $25 to $28 billion on capital expenditures like buying new machines or building out factories just next year. Just for comparison, chip design companies spend somewhere between 3 to 5% of their revenues on capex, and this incredible expense is one of the reasons why most chip companies don't run their own fabs and why TSMC doesn't have much competition left. Most competitors, like Global Foundries for example, just gave up on trying to compete with the Taiwanese giant at the bleeding edge because it didn't make any economic sense. Chinese SMIC, which was originally built almost entirely on stealing TSMC's trade secrets, couldn't keep up with the Taiwanese giant after they were ordered to stop the theft, and while Samsung has slowly been catching up with them lately, TSMC remains the clear leader, having owned over half of the market ever since it was founded. Just to give you an idea of scale, at the writing of the script, TSMC is worth more than all of Samsung Electronics combined. Not just their chip foundry, but the whole conglomerate that includes the world's largest phone company, the world's largest TV company, the world's largest memory company, etc. It's insanity. So yeah, the fab business is both incredibly expensive and incredibly complex, and actually forms number 2 of our 3 bottlenecks in the chip industry. This is a winner-takes-all market where the little guys simply cannot afford to keep up on the bleeding edge, at least, with the big players. Alright, the next domain is equipment and software, and there are thousands of steps in making a chip, each of which requires custom equipment and software, but let me pick probably the most essential one to illustrate: lithography. In this step, the manufacturer takes what is called a mask, essentially a blueprint of the final chip, and uses light to imprint miniature copies of that onto the silicon wafer. This is the step that actually transfers design onto silicon, and the machines used to create it are some of humanity's most incredible feats of engineering. At the cutting edge, EUV or extreme ultraviolet lithography machines are used, and unlike in consumer marketing, extreme ultra actually feels like an understatement for what they do. The light used in these machines has wavelength so short that even the air absorbs it, so they have to work in a vacuum, and to generate that light they use an ultra-high-powered laser to blast tiny drops of liquid tin mid-air somewhere around 50,000 times a second to create plasma, which then creates the light that they bounce through an insane web of lenses and mirrors and onto the wafer. Engadget has a fantastic video explaining EUV in detail that I've linked to down in the description, but because of how complex EUV is, especially at the bleeding edge, there is essentially only one company that has cracked the code on it. Dutch firm ASML is the sole producer of high-end EUV machines, and a single one of their machines weighs around 100 tons and costs around $130 million. The company only makes about 25 of them a year, of which TSMC has bought more than half this year, and they are such a sign of legitimacy that a Chinese company called Hongxin scammed their local government into giving them state subsidies because they owned a single older generation ASML machine. Like that almost on its own was enough to convince the government right before the company mortgaged the machine off without ever having used it. So yeah, much like with fabs, making high-end equipment for the industry is so complex and so expensive that there are just not a lot of players left on the high end. And in some areas, like for example lithography, there is essentially a monopoly. And this, as you might have guessed, is bottleneck number 3 in the industry. And as EUV relies on a lot of US tech, this is the bottleneck that the Trump administration actually used to force non-US companies like TSMC to stop making chips for Huawei. If they didn't drop their Huawei business, the US could cut them off of things like EUV, and that would be game over for a high-end fab. And the last domain in semiconductors is often called packaging and testing. And this is where the silicon wafer gets cut up into individual chips, wires and connectors get attached, the chips are put into protective housing and then finally tested for quality before being sold. And to put it bluntly, this domain is much less high-tech and much less consequential than the others. It is typically outsourced to hundreds of different companies, so just know that it exists and I will spare you a deep dive on it. So that's your overview of how the chip industry works, and over the last couple of years of obsessing over this topic, there's a couple of main realizations that I've had. First, almost all of the incredible diversity and competition in the industry comes from the design phase, while the rest of the industry is going through massive consolidation, which leads to the entire industry increasingly depending on just a handful of essentially irreplaceable companies. As semiconductors get more and more complex with each round of miniaturization, that also makes it more and more expensive to compete in this space, which creates further concentration of power, and that in turn creates lots of economic and political tensions. The US, who makes by far the most money from chips by being home to most chip design companies, is increasingly nervous about having to rely on foreign companies for manufacturing. Europe said this month that its digital sovereignty was under threat, so it would spend billions to double its chip manufacturing market share from 10% to 20%, and China has been throwing money at semiconductors, desperately trying to establish itself as a major player for years, quadrupling their spending again just last year. Now, of these three, I believe China is the most desperate, as they have both the highest demand for chips as the electronics capital of the world, and also the weakest domestic chip industry, making only 6% of the chips that the country itself consumes. I think the next 5 to 10 years will be all about China trying to move up the value chain, especially in semiconductors, and the best explainer that I found on this topic is a book called AI Superpowers: China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. It is written by Kai-Fu Lee, the former head of Google China, and while it technically focuses on AI, I have found it to be the best description of China's tech industry trying to upgrade itself in general. It captures the trends, the economics, the politics, the culture, all of it, and it points out where the country is doing great and where it is doing poorly with brutal accuracy. I listened to this book on Audible, and as someone who has lived in China and worked in Chinese tech companies, I found myself nodding along multiple times, feeling like finally somebody has captured the real essence of this industry and described it as it is. If you are into tech at all, I think this is a must listen, and you can get it for free with a 30-day Audible trial. I use Audible before falling asleep, while in the shower, while cooking. It's a great way to learn something new or relax on the go, and a subscription not only gets you 1 credit for any audiobook that you want from their huge library, but also free access to Audible original podcasts, guided fitness and meditation classes, and more. Check them out at audible.com/techaltar. That link is also down in the description, and if you use it, it really helps the channel, or just text TechAltar to 500 500. And if you read the book, or if you listen to the book rather, AI Superpowers, do let me know what you think about it. Alright, I'll see you in the next video.
Pranked.
This video was sponsored by CuriosityStream in partnership with my streaming service Nebula. When Steve Jobs announced the first iPhone in 2007 and Google leaned all in on Android soon after, most of the tech world saw that change was on the horizon. But few could predict just how thoroughly and quickly smartphones would sweep away everything in their wake. An entirely new form factor combined with new consumer preferences, supply chains, and business models threw once invincible industry titans off balance for just long enough to let new entrants from Apple to Xiaomi enter and take the entire industry for themselves. The car industry today is roughly where the phone industry was in 2009. It has passed its iPhone moment already, its Android moment is happening now, and there are parallels everywhere if you just look close enough. It is no coincidence that every major smartphone company in the world, from Xiaomi to Huawei, LG to Sony, they are all entering the car business now. And in the 73rd episode of the Story Behind series, I will break down what we can learn from the smartphone revolution from the past and what we can apply to the car revolution of the future.
XS-1 Goliath incoming. XS-1 Goliath is landing.
The major trends of the car industry, so electrification, self-driving, always-on connectivity, and the increased adoption of screens and software, these all have two things in common. One, they fundamentally changed the business of both making and selling cars, and two, they have nothing to do with the core strength traditional car makers have accumulated over decades. There are few visual metaphors more striking for this than BMW, a few years ago, lighting up their iconic headquarters building after the cylinders of combustion engines to present them as if they were batteries instead. Oh, the irony. Sure, the cars of the past will have a lot in common with the cars of the future. After all, they will all have wheels, seats, windshields and such. But much like the feature phones sharing components with the smartphones wasn't enough to save industry titans like Nokia and Ericsson, it's far from certain that being great at bending metal plates or designing blinkers, for example, will let car companies like BMW or Toyota survive the onslaught of the dozens of new competitors that are coming straight for them either. Last year, 40% of the cost of the average car was already spent on electronics, which was up from 27% a decade ago and 18% a decade before that. So from a cost perspective, cars are already on track to become more consumer electronics items than they are a collection of engines and seats anyway. And as drivers will spend less time looking at the road ahead of them, more time looking at the internet connected giant screens in their vehicles in the future, it's likely that revenues will soon follow too. Some companies already let users upgrade self-driving software over the air or purchase upgrades for things like their headlights on paid software updates, and it's not hard to see that trend accelerating in the future. Phones were almost entirely a hardware business at first, but once they connected to the internet and their wallets conveniently and opened up their app stores to third-party developers, they became an internet and software business too, spawning a real cottage industry of third-party software companies around them. Software eats the world, as the famous quote from Mark Andreessen goes, and it will inevitably eat the car business too, where consumers will buy software, get bombarded by ads, and will likely choose cars based on the tech that they have at least as much as they will choose them over the luxurious wooden panels or heated leather seats or whatever. In other words, both the costs and the revenues of cars will increasingly be tied to the tech going forward, in the car business of the future more similar to the smartphone business of today than the car business of the past. Traditional car companies can, of course, today already see the iceberg on the horizon, and they're trying desperately to avoid it. They're adding electrification, self-driving, better software and so on to their cars as we speak. But if the phone giants of the past have taught us anything, it is that big ships are really slow to turn, and just seeing the iceberg doesn't mean that the company will be able to avoid it. Interestingly, the car industry is starting to parallel the phone industry in yet another fundamental way too. When the iPhone first launched, it quickly became clear to the industry that this fundamental model could and in fact had to be emulated. So a web of suppliers from Google to Qualcomm, MediaTek, Corning, as well as thousands of manufacturing companies across Asia sprung into action and brought around the Android revolution in record time. Their important achievement was componentizing and standardizing this new form factor. Suddenly, making a smartphone became less like art and more like assembling Lego blocks. New startups, Xiaomi could have access to the same apps, processors, camera sensors, etc. as Nokia and Sony Ericsson, for example, and they could even have contract manufacturers like Foxconn assemble the phones for them at similar quality levels too, so they just had to focus on designing and selling their phones. This componentization really leveled the playing field, and an almost exactly parallel revolution is happening in the car industry right now as well. The iPhone moment of the car industry came, of course, in the form of Tesla. Much like with the iPhone, it took a few tries to find the necessary polish, but not only was Tesla incredibly right about the fundamentals, from electrification to self-driving and software-driven interiors, they also emulated Apple's business model by aggressively pursuing vertical integration and ecosystem building. Tesla builds its own software, it designs its own chips, it develops its own self-driving algorithms to run on those chips, it makes its own batteries lately, and it has an exclusive ecosystem of fast chargers on the road, batteries to mount at home, and soon an exclusive tunnel system to shuttle Tesla owners around underground as well. Tesla is a vertically integrated exclusive ecosystem business, just like Apple is. And now that it has shown the world what all the building blocks of this new form factor are and created consumer demand for them, the rest of the industry is jumping in to compete in the same way too. Seeing Tesla's rise from nothing to becoming the world's most valuable car company in just a couple of years has really opened the eyes of everybody in the industry, and they all realized that this model not only could, it had to be emulated. And so the car industry as a whole is experiencing its own sort of Android mode right now. A few weeks ago, Nvidia announced Orin and Atlan, their next generation SoCs for cars, as well as their reference kit called Hyperion, which also includes all the necessary sensors, circuitry, and software to let car makers basically add intelligence and self-driving capabilities to their cars like a Lego. A few months before that, LG and contract manufacturer Magna announced that they'll be working on electric powertrains, including motors, inverters, onboard chargers, etc., that companies could easily build into their own cars, and are rumored to have the Apple car as one of their first customers. Before that, Volkswagen surprised the world by making its entire MEB electric platform available to license. This includes the motors, the batteries, the powertrain, etc. of their most mass-market electric car, the ID.3, and Ford has already signed on to build a car on it. There are startups like AI Native that develop the entire self-driving capabilities on behalf of their clients, contract manufacturers like Foxconn who are getting into the business of assembling cars on behalf of others, and standardized charging networks are being built out all over the world by industry alliances to take on Tesla's supercharger network too. The Android moment of the car industry is truly upon us, and it will likely be just as disruptive for cars as it was to phones about a decade ago. Componentization and standardization has created a default operating system on computers and phones, so it's likely to do the same on cars in the future too, replacing most of the weird custom user interfaces manufacturers of the past have pushed on users over time, with Sony, Huawei, and many others trying their hands at the modern solution already, and new companies like Polestar announcing that they're simply embracing Google software for their cars instead of even trying to build their own. And once even new entrants will have access to basically the same world-class engines, batteries, charging networks, self-driving tech, manufacturing, etc. as the big guys, the playing field will well and truly be leveled, and there'll be nothing holding back these small companies from taking on the established giants. Not only that, the consumer psychology will likely change too, devaluing the decades-long brand-building exercises car makers have spent billions on. After all, if new brands use the same core components as the existing ones, and consumers actually know about that, they will be much less likely to believe that a Mercedes or Audi is actually worth paying double for. Now, a very interesting example of a car being built by a tech company using this new componentized model is the Vision S by Sony, which the company has recently started road testing. I have a whole extra segment breaking down that car and its impact in the extended version of this video that is available only on Nebula, which of course is our very own video streaming platform built and owned by creators, and fun fact, it now includes MKBHD as well. That's right, Marcus is now on Nebula too. We often add a few extra bits to videos on Nebula. My Tech Altar videos typically go live there a day or two early. There are tons of great Nebula originals, and since we own the platform, signing up supports us, the creators, directly instead of having to rely on a web of annoying ads or constant tracking. Best of all, you can get access to all of Nebula for free with a subscription to my sponsor CuriosityStream, which itself is less than $15 for an entire year. That's like barely more than $1 a month. CuriosityStream is of course the premier place on the internet for high quality professional documentaries from the founder of the Discovery Channel, and they have built a huge library of science, nature, and history content to binge while you are stuck at home. I have recently finished watching an episode of Catalyst on CuriosityStream, which took a closer look at the potential of quantum computing, and there's a ton of other great content here from hosts like David Attenborough, Jane Goodall, Stephen Hawking, and more. So check them out at the link in the description, and I'll see you next week.
How perfectly flat it is, in case you're into that. Fun fact. So, the iPhone's display, incredible on paper, great color accuracy, flat, plenty bright and sharp, but also still has a huge notch at the top, still stuck at 60 Hz, and still scratches as easily as ever. It's glass. Par for the course. There is a lot that goes into the testing of a set of new smartphone cameras. And it usually ends up being the longest section of the review, just because so many phones have gotten so good that it feels like the camera is one of the last things that really differentiates them. But here we are with the iPhone 12 Pro and its triple camera system. So these are all top-of-the-line cameras, but you probably already knew that, and honestly, I could probably have just ended it there. Like, you know you're getting good, consistent point-and-shoot photos, high-quality videos, and a good mic. You're set. But that's not what you came here for, is it? So there's a lot more to say about these cameras. So first of all, the iPhone's cameras haven't really changed all that much since they started getting really good a few years ago. If it ain't broke, they definitely don't fix it here. Which is funny because the headphone jacks also weren't broken, but I guess they didn't feel the same way about that. But the point is, there's not going to be some huge year-over-year difference with the iPhone cameras because they don't have much to change. The sensor size is going to stay about the same. It's a 12-megapixel optically stabilized sensor. This one has an f1.6 aperture, letting in plenty of light, and it's flanked by a 120-degree 12-megapixel ultra-wide at f2.4 and a 2.5x optical telephoto at f2.0, a LiDAR scanner, a mic, and a flash to finish off that stovetop. The thing about the iPhone camera, though, that we sometimes forget when we get super into the technical weeds is it's designed to be as simple as possible, as easy as possible to use, while still achieving results that are very difficult to get any other way. So when Steve Jobs unveiled the original iPhone back in 2007, stay with me, this was one of the slides he showed on stage. It's a graph of ease of use versus how smart something is. And of course, he absolutely trashes all the competition, talking about how they're not very smart or they're not very easy to use. And the iPhone is going to be way up in the corner, just a classic, extremely scientific Apple chart on stage. So while the rest of the competition is definitely caught up on those axes, when you just look at the camera, just the camera, the iPhone still squeezes further up into that corner than any other phone out there right now. This camera app is dead simple, and it has been forever. Everyone knows how to point and shoot. Tap to focus if you really need to, and if you need any extra controls, they're typically hidden away, maybe one swipe and a tap away. And when you point and shoot, the software does a lot of heavy lifting thanks to Smart HDR, thanks to multiple exposures, thanks to computational photography, and thanks to a great image signal processor that makes it all happen very quickly. It would be really hard to get the results that the iPhone gets from any other camera system with just plain point and shoot, and that is what the iPhone is so good at. So I give it all the credit in the world for point and shoot, but what about the few times when you actually do want to get a little more custom? What about the times when you do want a little bit more manual control? That is when the Apple way can sort of bite you, because there isn't a whole lot of that in the stock iPhone camera app. There actually isn't a Pro mode in the iPhone 12 Pro's camera. Now, fortunately, they have gone ahead and added ProRAW, which can give you a lot more flexibility in the editing process, and there are some apps in the App Store that can help the shooting process for you, but I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of really good smartphone cameras, and I think if you were to do some sort of blind smartphone camera test with a bunch of different phones, all in manual mode to dial in the exact perfect photo, you might be surprised which one comes out on top. They all look really good. But where the iPhone separates itself is delivering consistent, great results with minimal effort. So every year I describe iPhone photos in the review, And every year, it's pretty similar. They've got this crunchy, processed look, but not too over-sharpened or over-processed. Plenty of dynamic range and detail for such a small file. And the iPhone is notorious for flattening out pictures with faces, making sure it always brightens up any faces that might be in the shadows or not exposed too well. It will always sacrifice the rest of the image if it has to, in favor of the subject, or the face, which most would argue is the smart thing to do in full auto. But when you spend $1,000+ on a smartphone, there's going to be a lot of people who want to do more than just point and shoot. And so that's where there's some edge cases where the iPhone camera does get beat out by the competition. Zoom is a big one. The iPhone 12 Pro maxes out at 12 times digital zoom. There's a few phones out right now with 10 times optical zoom lenses that max out in the triple digits for digital zoom. So, then there's other winners with even wider ultra-wides, or winners with laser autofocus. But again, as far as point and shoot goes, which is what most people want out of most of their photos, most of the time, the iPhone nails that. Now, videos. This is where, to me, the iPhone separates itself as the best overall camera system in a smartphone. Because there's another layer to this, which is app support. So you've probably seen by now some of the memes about how a video from an Android phone will look like a blurry, pixelated mess on Instagram, while the one from the iPhone looks great. And there's a hint of truth behind that, and there's a reason for it. The truth is, a video shot on a high-end Android phone and the iPhone 12 Pro would be very similar. Comparable, either one could win. But a video shot inside of the Instagram app on a high-end Android phone versus the iPhone 12 Pro will have a massive difference. And that's because for years, many of the most popular apps with camera functions were simply screenshotting the viewfinder in Android phones instead of actually plugging directly into the camera feed like they do with iPhones. There was an Android Police article just the other day about how the Galaxy S21 is the only Android phone that doesn't suck at Snapchat because they actually plug straight into the camera feed on this phone. And that may seem like a step forward for Android, and maybe that's a new future direction, but fundamentally it still comes down to development. If I am a new app making something camera related and I can develop one version of my app for as many users as possible, I'm going to make an iPhone version because that's one version of the app for many millions of people. And trying to make a bunch of different optimized new versions for a bunch of different Android phones will just be a process of diminishing returns. So it's cool to see a version once in a while for like the S21 Ultra, or back when the Pixel had the visual port, that would be cool once in a while, but the iPhone seems like it'll always have this development advantage, at least for the near future, which is actually the main reason why I carry an iPhone. So that being said, if you want all the in-depth info on the new cameras, plus the differences I found between the 12 Pro and the 12 Pro Max with the larger sensor, better stabilization, and improved zoom, yes, I did make a video about all those things, but the bottom line here is it isn't much of a difference in most shots until you get to the edge cases, which is where that stuff can produce less noisy photos on the Max. Also, you remember Dolby Vision? About how there's this huge deal made about the fact that the iPhone 12 series is the first set of Dolby Vision certified cameras, and suddenly it was about to become a huge deal and everyone would start shooting HDR all the time. Well, that hasn't really played out yet. Don't get me wrong, the video files look great. Dolby Vision HDR video from an iPhone looks amazing on an iPhone. And if you send it to other iPhones, it'll look phenomenal on those displays. But the second you have to export it and send it somewhere else, that's where the experience starts to fall apart. iPhone's Dolby Vision video is using HLG, which stands for Hybrid Log Gamma. And without getting super into the weeds on file formats and nits, it's just not compatible everywhere. So if I shoot a Dolby Vision HDR video on my iPhone and I want to share it somewhere like Twitter, Instagram, or even an Apple TV where it's not supported, well then the video gets converted and mapped to an SDR image, fitting all of that HDR information back into a standard dynamic range screen. And to me, that SDR image doesn't look great. So Dolby Vision HDR video looks super good when it works. And I've seen some awesome examples even on YouTube of iPhone 12 Pro HDR videos. And if you have the right monitor or the right phone, then these videos look awesome. But I'm still waiting for the best, most reliable HDR pipeline for getting a video shot here to hit your eyeballs compatibly, beautifully every time. But in summary, overall, the iPhone cameras, pretty good.
24/7.
I think it would be foolish to overlook MagSafe. MagSafe is one of the most interesting new features on the iPhone 12 series, not because of anything amazing physically. I mean, it's just a wireless charging puck with some magnets in it that align with the back of the iPhone. Simple. But the extra layer on top is there's rumors Apple's eventually going to be getting rid of the charging port as early as this year. So that means we could be looking at the future of charging on all iPhones. And then the fun part is it also brings the potential of a whole ecosystem of magnetic iPhone accessories enabled through MagSafe. So first of all, on the name, I get why they called it MagSafe. It's beloved branding, but it doesn't quite serve the same utility as the original MagSafe. So if you rely on this MagSafe puck to charge your phone and you accidentally bump the wire, the phone is absolutely coming with it. It's hardly any more safe than a normal wire. But that being said, it works. Slaps on the back just like that, charges at 15 watts, and that's fine. There are a number of pretty decent MagSafe accessories, kind of like this, that are just cases that are compatible with MagSafe, meaning if you slap the charger on the back, it will also magnetize and work through it. This happens to be one of Nomad's leather cases for the iPhone 12 Pro Max here. But other than that, I was kind of hoping there would also be a separate ecosystem just with the MagSafe magnet inside. And this to me was going to open up this whole new world of things sticking to the back of the iPhone with magnets, and it's barely good sometimes. It might depend on your car's suspension at this point, but for me, it slowly sinks down while I'm driving until it eventually falls off the magnets. So it feels like this magnetic charging puck is the best MagSafe accessory out still, 5 months later. Although there is some stuff in the pipeline by Moment that I'm hoping to get my hands on. That looks pretty cool. It makes some big claims about also having a proprietary magnet array that's a little stronger. I'll believe it when I see it. But long story short, I'm calling it an accessory now, but it may be a necessity in the very near future, because if the next iPhone truly doesn't have any ports, then you will have to wirelessly charge your phone every single time. So I guess this MagSafe puck would be the best way to do that. The biggest bummer for me would really just be the charging speed. So wireless charging is already pretty inefficient, but there's a lot of innovation going on with companies pushing super fast wireless charging speeds, 40, 50, 60 watt wireless charging. Apple, not doing that at all. MagSafe is 15 watts, period. Actually, it's 12 watts on the iPhone 12 mini. And even if you plug into a faster brick, it's going to limit that charge to that 15 watts. Long term, it is true that this is better for your battery health, and if you want your phone to last a number of years, then that's what you're getting here. But sometimes you just want to charge it fast, you know? I guess that's why they're calling it MagSafe, because for your battery, it is safe. The iPhone 12 Pro has a 3,687 milliamp-hour battery. On paper, that's actually pretty small. We're very used to flagship smartphones nowadays having anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 milliamp hours, sometimes more, rarely less. But thanks to the iPhone's efficiency, their vertical integration, their optimization, all the classic stuff we've talked about for years, that number doesn't really mean nearly as much as the actual day-to-day performance, which is great. On the iPhone 12 Pro, I can consistently get 6 to 7 hours of screen on time, which is really good for a phone this size. On heavier days though, with a lot more navigation or just more taxing use, maybe I'm pulling a lot of data or playing games or using the camera a lot, then it'll drop faster. The A14 Bionic chip inside is very powerful, so it can move through battery quickly enough to kill it in a day with less than 5 hours of screen on time. But for me anyway, that's a pretty uncommon day. So the only thing you really start to think about more and more after the phone comes out is longer-term battery health. And to be honest, 5 months later still is a pretty short amount of time in the relative grand scheme of things as far as batteries go, but you want this thing to last 3, 4, or maybe even 5+ years. And iPhones have a good history here, and this iPhone 12 Pro that I've been using still shows 100% battery health. And that's just kind of it for battery. Apple's kind of a bit boring in the battery department. I just was talking about it in the MagSafe section, but Apple has never led the industry in charging speed. They have never led the industry in battery size. And there are Android phones left and right doing split battery cells across foldable form factors, even doing split battery cells to do faster charging in parallel. There are phones doing 50, 60, even 100, 120 watts, which is absolutely unreal and can get you from dead to full sometimes in half an hour. The iPhone has never done any of that. It's just a simple, modest-sized cell that lasts a reasonable amount of time.
Flash out! Enemy down!
Hardpoint contested.
The iPhone isn't just a piece of hardware, it's the software that runs on it, and it's the ecosystem that surrounds it. Now, there isn't really a whole lot of extra stuff to say about iOS on the iPhone 12 Pro specifically that's new here. In fact, that's actually one of the things people like the most about it, is it is incredibly consistent. They don't change too much year over year, they never have, and older iPhones will have literally the exact same software experience as the new iPhone as soon as the new iPhones come out. So all I really have to say about iOS this time around is the stuff that was supposed to be new. Widgets. So widgets finally came to iOS after having them on Android for the past 12 years or so. So when Apple comes late to the party on something, usually there's some reason they're going to do it the Apple way. They're going to do it better, even though they weren't first. And now that I've had them for about 5 months on the iPhone 12 Pro, they're actually kind of better and worse at the same time. So iOS 14's widgets are really good. I actually think their implementation in iOS, while it's a little less custom, does feel a little more polished and controlled, as you'd expect from iOS. But when I first went over all of iOS 14's new features in that video, we saw a few widgets Apple built in that demonstrated huge potential. There's widget smart stacks and some really informative widgets to give you live updating information. They were all fairly clean and consistent visually. You still can't quite put it exactly where you want on every home screen, but this felt like the iOS way, and so now it was up to all our favorite apps and developers to update their apps to make great widgets like they did on Android. So where they ended up worse is there's actually not as many, and they're still not quite as customizable as they are on Android. Now, maybe it's a bit unfair to expect all my favorite apps to have updated with widget support like they've had a decade to do on Android, but just in the apps I use 5 months later, there's a Waze widget on Android, but not on iOS. There's a SoundCloud widget on Android, really useful playback controls, not on iOS. There's an Asana widget on Android, but not on iOS. So there are less widgets and overall less customization within the widgets themselves, but overall, the quality of the widgets feels a bit better. So, sounds about right for Apple. That being said, I was really curious how many people really use widgets. And so I did a poll on Twitter asking you guys, how many of you guys use widgets on your home screen, how many don't? And it turns out about 75% of you do, whether you're on Android or on iOS, which I found very interesting. So then we've got the new app library all the way to the right. Now this isn't quite the app drawer that so many of us love on Android, but it's getting there, and it's definitely useful for finding everything in one place and not needing to have every single app on a home screen or in some folders. So the iPhone's home screen situation will continue developing over time. And speaking of developing over time, so will the ecosystem. You can't talk about the iPhone without at least touching on the ecosystem around it. So Apple's ecosystem gets a little more complete surrounding the iPhone every year. Just this year, they added the HomePod Mini, they added AirPods Max, and the long-rumored AirTags are probably coming soon. And in the walled garden analogy, that can either be the inside of that garden getting even more lush and beautiful, or it can be the walls of the garden getting a little bit higher. Either way, I think they're kind of both true. The point is, it's making it harder to leave. I really don't have any fundamental problem with the way iOS works. It's mature enough now that at this point, any change they make is a small little added feature or a little experiment. Widgets were easily the biggest new thing, but they've pretty much locked in stuff like their swipe up gesture and the timing and responsiveness of animations, even if it is a little jarring coming from a square edge instead of a rounded edge. And they've locked up the camera UI fundamentals for so long, pretty much everyone on Earth knows how they work by now. I don't like the power button, for example, how it doesn't just turn off the phone, it also triggers Siri with a long press. Remember when power buttons just turn phones on and off? But the most consistently frustrating thing in iOS to me that I wish they would evolve is not notifications, although that could also use some work too, but settings. Just the fact that there are so many settings separated from the app and moved into the settings app. It's just been annoying for a long time. But guess what? The iPhone is still a ridiculously popular phone for a reason. It doesn't change too much year over year. There's nothing too dramatic happening versus the last one. People understand it. They're used to it. Both my parents use an iPhone at this point, and it would be really hard to recommend they switch to another phone, even if that phone is technically better. The cost of switching is high, and that's on purpose. Okay, so the arrival of 5G on the iPhone finally. 5G's been a topic we've hyped up and talked about for a long time, and there were a lot of big promises made when 5G finally arrived on the iPhone. They opened their whole keynote with Verizon's CEO on stage talking about 5G for a while, so it had a lot of promise to it. Most notably, 5G just got real. Well, we have the benefit of hindsight now. Were they right? Did 5G just get real by adding it to the 12 series? No. I mean, mostly no. 5G rolling out to the world is an infrastructure thing. It is going to be a slow, literal building process for that to happen. So that won't suddenly happen quickly because of any one individual phone. That being said, yes, there are now many millions more 5G customers out in the world because of this new iPhone. But here's a more interesting question. Do you even want or need 5G in the first place? Because here's the thing, we've seen tons of promises of this wild, awesome 5G-enabled future with robo-taxis and remote robot surgeries and insanely fast internet speeds everywhere you go. But, as you saw in my 5G Explained video, we're not there yet. I mean, realistically, 5G speeds are not actually that much dramatically better than 4G speeds. Sometimes they're a little better, sometimes they're actually worse. The rare exception to that is when you're in a stone's throw range of a millimeter wave tower, in which case you might get incredible speeds until you walk away. I actually demonstrated pretty clearly in my video that if you're within eyesight of that millimeter wave tower, you get fantastic speeds, but as soon as there's an obstacle between you and the tower, or if you literally even go behind a window or turn your back to the tower, then you're gonna lose some of that signal. So 5G is cool, 5G has a lot of promise for the future, but it is not going to suddenly get real because of one phone or any one technology. The one thing you can say about the iPhone, which is why they're using these terms, is there are now millions of people out there who are walking around with their first 5G phone. Some of these people will live in an area with 5G coverage and will benefit right away. Some of these people will live in an area that doesn't have it, but that's about to get 5G coverage in the next few years, and they'll see that benefit soon. And some of these people will live in an area with no 5G, and they won't benefit at all. Those people can just turn 5G off and use the iPhone just like their last one. Also, one of the fun facts is if you didn't upgrade to a 5G phone, the millions of people who just left the 4G network with their 5G iPhones may actually make your 4G speeds a little bit better. To Apple's credit, they've managed to minimize 5G's effect on battery life pretty well. Some early 5G phones, and this happened with 4G too, had worse battery life because of how inefficient it is to constantly pump for a 5G signal. And you might have even seen that now deleted tweet of Verizon account asking people to turn off 5G to improve their battery life. But I actually found that the iPhone does a really good job with power management. It's well known now that it doesn't actually connect to 5G all the time. It really just switches it on when you're downloading something or using a lot of data when you really need it. If you're not, it might show you the 5G logo, but it won't actually be connected to 5G, and it'll save you some battery. And honestly, you probably never notice. So the effect on battery life has been minimal, and a step has been taken forward towards getting the world's internet users onto 5G. But it definitely didn't suddenly get real.
Hardpoint is ours.
Okay, so you know how every year, as soon as a new iPhone comes out, there is a rapid and dramatic search for literally anything that could be possibly wrong with this new phone. And if there is anything, then that becomes a headline, and we're all just trying to find the latest and newest gate. Signal strength drops when I hold the phone in a vice grip. Antenna gate. Some iPhones have charging problems. Charge gate. Maybe the iPhone can be bent in half. Bend gate. I did an entire video called iPhone Gates Explained. You can watch that. But this year it's been pretty quiet, right? There's not that much controversial stuff about this iPhone, but I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. I feel like there's always got to be something. There's got to be something for the YouTube channels to feast on for views. There's got to be some sort of gate that we can talk about, right? What is the gate? Oh, maybe it's the display again, right? There's always some sort of element of controversy with the screen. And this screen is nice, but it is a $1,000 phone with a comically big notch, and it's somehow still 60 hertz, and Apple's getting away with it. So surely that's worth the gate, maybe? There's also been some occasional bubbling up of OLED tint issues. So I've seen a couple forums and YouTube videos talk about green tint on the iPhone's display. hasn't really been enough of that happening for Apple to respond to it yet, but it's kind of out there. Or, oh, actually, maybe it's just the fact that it still uses Lightning. Actually, no, it's the iPhone. It uses Lightning every year. I mean, we knew they were never going to go to USB-C for the iPhone. That's not really a gate. Actually, you know what? I think I know what it is. I think the bar for a gate is something that gets a response from Apple. It's gotta crush that threshold. Like, you have to find something that's so major that Apple's engineers didn't find and their testers didn't find, but it's such a big emission that Apple has to go then respond to. That would be a gate. And maybe the only thing that qualifies for that would be
Hardpoint identified.
So there is no charger in the box of the iPhone 12 series. And so this is pretty significant. Of course, it didn't get a reaction from Apple, but it was so big that it needed a sort of pre-reaction, which was an explanation by Apple in their keynote about why they were doing it. So we saw them take the environmental angle. You know, less chargers in the box means less e-waste, people will throw them away, less wasted space with packaging, and more iPhones shipped per truck, per train, and per pallet. Efficiency, saving the world. Now, when you actually break this down, yes, you are saving some e-waste by not shipping charging bricks that people could potentially throw away if they don't need them. But, on the other hand, the cable that ships with the iPhone is a USB-C to Lightning cable, and most people who own iPhones don't have a USB-C charger, so they have to buy that USB-C charging brick anyway, which is more packaging and more money. And now they're throwing away their old bricks, and it's kind of not really making any difference. So as much as we all hate this, and we can kind of see the environmental angle, we can also sort of see how this is already starting to become normal. So since this iPhone shipped in a small box with no charger, the Xiaomi Mi 11 has also shipped in a small chargerless box, but they'll still give you a charger if you ask for it. And then the Galaxy S21 series did the same, but they're not trying to give you a free charger at all. When Apple does something, the rest of the industry takes notice, they're all watching, and they often react. And so just like we saw with the headphone jack, where there felt like there was about a 1-year buffer time, where you could make fun of what Apple was doing with the headphone jack before you delete all your ads making fun of them and copy them in your next phone. I feel like the buffer time is even shorter with this one. But the difference and the danger with this trend is, well, all the innovation we've been seeing over the past few years in battery tech and charging tech and this like race to the fastest charging phone, does that just end? I really hope not. So that's what really makes this a gate, to me at least, is it's not just the, okay, Apple's not shipping a charger with the phone anymore, and ooh, look how greedy this seems like they're being, but the ripple effect that this inevitably has on the rest of the industry. And at the end of the day, I think that's what makes the iPhone such a fascinating product to begin with. Is, you know, it started off by changing the world in 2007, but every time they update it after that, it has these second and third order effects on the rest of the smartphone world around it. That's what's so crazy about the iPhone. There are companies that make entire phones based on rumors of what Apple might do in a future iPhone, just so they can be Apple. That is wild. All right, I think that's it. I think that's everything that I've wanted to say about the iPhone that I haven't in some way in some videos. I'm glad we did this. This is, if you made it straight through to the end of this video, watch the whole thing, we've been through a lot together, so I appreciate you. Also, I know this is a different shirt this time. That's what happens when it's a long video. It takes more than one day to shoot. But if you skipped directly to the end, this conclusion here, well, you missed the most exciting part. But either way, yeah, I'm super curious what you guys think. To me, it's not just about making a longer video just to make a long video. It's about being able to cover all of a topic instead of just a narrow slice of it like we normally are compelled to. But hey, if you guys watched the video and you enjoyed it, we can do more of this type of stuff. So let me know in the comment section below. Also, down below, right below the like button, are all the references and all the links of all the stuff I talked about during this video, as promised. Cool. That's it. Thanks for watching. Now a word from the only sponsor brave enough to tack at the end of this gigantic video, ExpressVPN. Shout out to the sponsor of this video, ExpressVPN. So, quick question. How did you choose which internet provider that you use? Actually, I'll probably just answer that for you. You likely didn't have a choice, or if you did, pretty lucky because in most areas you don't have a choice. And so because these ISPs essentially have a monopoly over the areas that they serve, if they start doing things you disagree with, or if they start to track all the websites you visit, even when you're in incognito mode, what are you going to do, switch? You can't. So using ExpressVPN stops this by rerouting your connection through a secure encrypted server so your ISPs can't see a thing. And also, rerouting your connection through a different server can actually be kind of fun. For example, if I want to watch Modern Family, it's not on US Netflix, no problem, I just connect to a server that's in the UK, refresh, and I can watch it. It's not just Modern Family, you can get thousands of other shows on Netflix, basically unlocked just by switching your location when you use ExpressVPN. So if you don't want your ISP to have complete control and knowledge over every website you visit, and you want to unlock more shows, it's kind of a no-brainer. You can grab ExpressVPN today, and if you use my code or go to expressvpn.com/mkbhd, that'll get you 3 extra months free. Thanks again to ExpressVPN for sponsoring this video.
Sentry gun ready for deployment. Airstrike is ready. Warning, friendly nuke has been launched. Repeat, friendly nuke has been launched. Hunter killer drone on standby. Friendly airstrike incoming. Keep on them. Winning storm. Sentry gun deployed. Sentry gun ready to deploy. We've taken the lead.
Truly one of my greatest feats. I am going to be live building not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4,